Back in Christmas of 2008, I received my very own Xbox 360, and with it, a copy of LEGO Indiana Jones The Original Adventures. I was a 6-year-old who didn't know what an Indiana Jones was, but I still played that game and had a blast. To this day, it's still the only LEGO game I ever 100% completed. After that, I finally got around to watching the movies the game was based on, and ever since then, the Indiana Jones series has been one of my favorites of all time. As a kid, these movies just hit all the right notes. They had cool action, memorable characters, kick-ass music, a sense of adventure, and the man himself was possibly the most awesome guy ever put in front of a camera, thanks in no small part to him being played by Harrison Ford, the coolest man alive. But as I've grown older to the ripe age of 45, I've only come to appreciate these movies more and more. Nowadays, I notice the incredible talent present in every aspect of the filmmaking, all thanks to none other than Steven Spielberg. But I would say I've ended up appreciating some of the movies a bit more than others, which brings us to the topic of this video. What's the best indie movie? Which one's the worst? Let's take a journey through all 5 Indiana Jones movies from worst to best. Number 5. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I think most people will agree that the title of worst Indiana Jones movie could only really go to Crystal Skull or Dial of Destiny. And I will admit it did take me a bit of internal debate to decide which one was worse, but in the end it was clear to me that Crystal Skull takes the cake. While this movie and Dial both share some downsides, for the most part the bad aspects of each movie are completely different. Once I explain both of them, you'll hopefully understand why I chose to put Dial over Skull. The main thing stopping this movie from being good for me is just how lame the story is. Now, story isn't what I or most people watch these movies for, but it's kinda hard to get invested in the action when you just don't give a crap about what's going on. The first movie, you wanted Indy to stop the Nazis because Nazis are evil. In the second movie, you wanted Indy to stop the thuggy cult of child slaves because child slavery is bad. And then in the third movie, you wanted Indy to stop the Nazis because Nazis are evil. As far as this movie goes, the first act or so I actually find to be pretty good, especially when Mutt comes into the story, since Shia LaBeouf and Harrison Ford have some real chemistry. But it's once the adventure starts for real that it starts to just become a slog. The villains for this movie are the Russians led by Irina Spalko, and her plan is to use the Crystal Skull's mind powers to project Soviet propaganda into everyone's heads. When you look back at the previous films, they never really told you what the bad guys were going to do with the MacGuffin when they got it. You just didn't want them to win because they were either child slavers or Nazis. This movie does tell us what the Russians' grand plan is, but it's just kinda stupid and silly. And the series is no stranger to either of those things, but it doesn't exactly get me invested. Spalko herself isn't really hitting for me as a villain either. Belloc had that rivalry with Indy and a cool accent, Mola Ram was so evil that it was funny, and while Donovan wasn't the most exciting villain in the world, there was also Elsa in the mix to make things a bit more interesting. Cate Blanchett's doing a funny accent which is welcome, but beyond that her character just comes across as kinda incompetent, and never really does anything to make us root against her. When she gets exploded from too much knowledge at the end, I just found it funny instead of satisfying. Another thing that's a downgrade from the previous films are the side characters. While Indy himself was always the star of a show, the people who accompanied him on the adventures played a huge part in making each of the movies stand out. And outside of Mutt, who I'll get to in a second, the characters this movie brings to the table aren't really particularly memorable. First there's Mac, this mate of Indy's who can never seem to make up his mind on whether he's a good guy or a bad guy. He's just kind of annoying, and in the end he dies for no reason and I felt nothing. You got this guy played by Jim Broadbent who's just a Marcus Brody replacement. He's fine I guess, but he's barely in the movie. I do like Broadbent though, so I'll give him a pass. One of the more important characters is Oxley, who we hear about having a history with the other characters, but we never really get to know him because he spends the whole movie with his brain not working. But the most important new character is of course Mutt Williams, played by Shia LaBeouf. I know a lot of people hate this guy, but I low-key think he's one of the best aspects of the movie. After they did the dad thing in Last Crusade, it makes total sense to flip it on its head and give Indy a son to play off this time, especially considering the time gap since the last film. And like I mentioned before, him and Indy have great chemistry, and the best stretch of a movie is when it's just the two of them playing off each other. The first scene of them in the diner is easily the best, with the little detail of Mutt taking the beer from the waitress and Indy putting it back without bringing any attention to it. Where we rapidly start to lose steam though is once we're reintroduced to the other major player in this film, Marion. It's obviously cool to see her again, but beyond the initial meetup and obvious reveal of Mutt being Indy's son, she has pretty much zero reason to be in the story. I assume they didn't want to continue the tradition of Indy hooking up with hot chicks because he's too old now, but you still need a love interest, so they brought back Marion as a kind of full circle moment I guess, even though this isn't the last movie in the series. I guess out of the three love interests to bring back, Marion was the only real choice, since no one liked Willie and Elsa is dead in a hole. But all she does in the story is reveal the Mutt's son thing, then drive the car, then get married to Indy at the end. So most of the characters don't leave much of an impression, but as long as there's good Indiana Jones action, I can overlook pretty much everything I just complained about. So is the action good? Mostly. It starts off really strong with the initial scene in the warehouse, which gives you all the classic Indy stuff you would want. Swinging around with a whip, driving cars, running around, all that good stuff. The motorbike chase that happens after Indy meets Mutt is easily the best scene in the whole movie. It feels right in line with the previous films and shows that Spielberg still has the juice. And Indy is just as athletic as he was in the first films despite the 19-year gap. But this is pretty much the last good action scene, with the extended jungle sequence that takes up a lot of the back half just looking like total shit thanks to all the CGI, plus some dumb shit with Mutt swinging around with monkeys and sword fighting with Cate Blanchett on top of cars. The part with the ants I actually kinda like though, mainly for it giving us a classic 1v1 fight between Indy and that Russian dude. It's still far off the equivalent scenes in the earlier movies that felt a lot more raw, but this one's still pretty good. And that kind of applies to the action throughout the whole movie. It's pretty good, but can get quite sucky at points, and never reaches those highs of the original trilogy. Back when this movie came out, the big question was, is Harrison Ford too old to play Indy? And looking back, I would say definitely not. I'm not sure how many stunts he did himself, but his age honestly doesn't impact the movie at all, outside a couple jokes at his expense.
You know, for an old man, you ain't bad in a fight.
Thanks a lot.
What are you, like 80?
So while I do think this movie is pretty bad overall, it's not terrible or anything. The obvious comparison with this movie is the Star Wars prequels, and it isn't nearly as bad as those. A disappointment to be sure, but you could do a lot worse. Number 4. The Dial of Destiny. My thoughts on this movie have changed quite a bit since I first saw it over a year ago. At first I thought it was even worse than Crystal Skull, but after watching it again, I've grown to appreciate it a lot more. Mainly I think this movie succeeds where Skull failed, which is the story. Harrison Ford was already kind of pushing it age-wise in 2008, and this is 15 years removed from that. So the writers kind of had no choice but to write the whole story around the fact that Indy is old as fuck. As such, it was only natural for the MacGuffin to be time travel related, and I know a lot of people don't like the fact that this movie does time travel, but I think it was pulled off about as well as it could be. It's not like the dial is some DeLorean-esque time machine, but it's more about fake maths and may or may not be designed to only send you back to the one point in time. The dial feels natural to me in a way that Aliens and Crystal Skull never did. It probably helps that the MacGuffin is a lot more integral to the story and its themes, while the Crystal Skull was just a thing the bad guys wanted and Indy had to stop them because they're bad. Anyways, I'm going to talk about the stuff I don't like now before getting back to the good stuff. I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but the worst thing about this movie in my opinion is the opening sequence of de-age Harrison Ford. There's several things that suck about this opening that all stack up. First off, the concept of a de-age Harrison Ford running around is already something that I'm just not a fan of from the get-go, since this type of shit has always looked horribly distracting, whether it be CGI Grand Moff Tarkin in Rogue One, or the horribly stilted deepfake Luke Skywalker in the Disney Plus crap. If the effect was flawless, I might be willing to overlook it, but unfortunately, CG Indy doesn't look much better than Luke in The Mandalorian. Whenever he's not moving or talking, he looks fine, and in one or two shots he genuinely looks flawless, particularly this hero shot when he first puts the hat on, but anytime he starts talking or running around, it looks like the Polar Express. Thankfully, the voice is at least 100% Harrison Ford, which does have the side effect of him sounding like an 80-year-old, but I'll take that over an AI voice like Vader in the Kenobi series. On top of this, the entire sequence is so dimly lit that you can barely see anything. It all just looks like grey sludge once they get outside the train. I'm assuming this was to attempt to hide how bad CG Indy looks, but it just ends up dampening the entire thing and looks like complete shit. The whole scene also just goes on for way too long. First Indy's captive in the castle, then there's this Looney Tunes segment where he's being hanged, then he has to get on the train, blah blah blah. They could have started with him already on the train and saved some time in this already far too long movie. Not that the rest of the action is any good, which I guess is a segue into a problem with the movie as a whole. The action isn't any good. When you're making an action-adventure movie with an 80-year-old in the lead role, it's kind of expected that the action might not be up to the same caliber as other similar movies. They managed to get away with a 65-year-old Harrison for Crystal Skull, but I guess that extra 15 years really makes all the difference, because you'll be hard-pressed to find Indy doing much more in this movie than driving cars and throwing a couple punches. You never see him run for longer than like 5 seconds, and he never really has a 1v1 fight scene equivalent to the previous movies, or any fight scene for that matter. In fact, during production of the movie, Harrison injured his shoulder while rehearsing this punch against Mads Mikkelsen, so yeah, he definitely wasn't doing any elaborate fight scenes. Thankfully, the movie does play into the fact that Indy is old, with one of my favourite scenes being this one of him and Helena climbing a wall.
I'm thinking. About what the hell I'm doing up here 40 feet in the air with cramped shoulders, crumbling vertebrae, a plate in one leg, screws in the other.
Yeah, I get it.
No, you don't get it. You're half my age.
But the fact the movie knows Indy is old doesn't really do much to deflate the fact that this movie, in a series of action-adventure movies, has a lead actor who can't do much action or adventure. There's a reason most of the set pieces are of characters driving around. It's because Indy can't do anything else. And while that does suck, I'd be willing to look past it if the action scenes we do get were just as exciting and well directed as the previous movies, but once again, they're pretty lackluster, and they all drag on way too long. James Mangold is clearly a competent director with Logan and Ford v Ferrari under his belt, so I don't really know what happened here. They filmed in a whole bunch of awesome locations even during Corona time, so it's not like this is some lazy CGI job. Clearly a lot of effort was placed here, but the way it's all put together just doesn't inspire any reaction from me other than mild amusement. While we're on the topic of direction, I think the movie looks pretty fine outside of it being way too dark a lot of the time, and there were clearly at least some attempts at doing Spielberg-esque lighting. My biggest problem is honestly how they change the classic map sequences when traveling around the globe to look all modern, and if you ask me, it looks like shit. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Also, this isn't really a proper complaint, just a personal nitpick, but I wish we got to see Indy using his whip more, considering it's his trademark thing, and seems like he should be able to swing it around even as an older guy. But after this one scene, he never uses it again. Seems like it could have had some use here, or during this whole sequence in the caves. But enough bashing, let's get back to the good things, because I really do think there's a lot to like here. The most obvious thing is that Harrison Ford is great in the role of Indy, and is every bit as fun to watch as he was over 40 years ago. Sure, he can't do all the whip swinging and brawling that he could back then, but he's still endlessly charming, has great chemistry with his co-stars, and he looks awesome in the costume even now. He's even got his tie that he wore in The Last Crusade, which I always thought was a really cool look. In fact, all my favourite moments in the movie aren't any of the big action scenes, but the smaller bits where it's just Harrison Ford doing his thing, especially during the first act or so. I already mentioned the cave scene, but I also love the whole sequence at the start of a movie where we're just seeing his morning routine. I'm just a sucker for these sorts of scenes in general, and there's some great gags here like when he adds some whiskey to his coffee and when he puts the thing in front of Marion's photo, which comes back all the way at the end of the movie. I'm also just a big fan of the idea of an older Indiana Jones feeling out of place in the modern world, well, as modern as the late 60s is. They really played up this aspect of a story during the promo of a movie, but it isn't really that important in the actual story outside of a few bits here and there. They do try to give Indy some proper character for this story, which is something that only Last Crusade put any sort of effort into previously, and I think it mostly works. To amp up the emotional beats, they split up Indy and Marion before the movie starts, and on top of that, they straight up killed Shia LaBeouf, even though I thought he was one of the best parts of Crystal Skull. I do get why they wrote him out though, since a lot of people didn't like him and Shia LaBeouf is a bit of a weirdo anyway. Plus it helps keep each movie distinct in terms of its roster of supporting characters. Speaking of supporting characters, the big addition of this film is Phoebe Waller-Bridge as Indy's goddaughter Helena, which in a lot of ways feels like an alternate take on the Mutt character. A younger character with some relation to Indy who brings their own skill set to the table and clashes with him personality-wise. I was pretty excited when I found out Phoebe was going to be involved since I'm a big Fleabag fan, and she isn't quite doing the exact same thing here, but there's definitely similarities. Unfortunately, while Helena is a pretty entertaining character, there's something missing that I can't quite place. She doesn't really have much going on beyond being funny and loving money, which is totally relatable, but I wish there was more to her and her relationship with Indy. She mostly just mocks him until near the end of the film where she decides to start caring. There's also her buddy Teddy, who's fine. He's no short round, but who is? For the villain, we've upgraded from Russian Cate Blanchett to Mads Mikkelsen, who is about as awesome as you would expect. He's as evil and menacing as you would hope for, but there's also this pathetic energy that Mads brings to his performance which I really love. It's the little moments, like when he sees Indy chasing after them in the tuk-tuk, and of course the end where he realizes he fucked up his calculations. I do wish he got a more gruesome death as is tradition for Indy villains, but that last shot of him looking like he's about to cry is pretty amusing regardless. His assortment of goons are pretty amusing, particularly Boyd Holbrook as this guy who just loves to shoot people. In terms of returning characters, it's pretty much an Indy-only movie, outside of a couple nostalgia moments with the decrepit Sala and Marion, who they had to make look older because Karen Allen aged too well. This ending is fine, but Indy having no agency at the end and just getting punched into leaving the past was just kind of weird, and it doesn't really compare to the riding into the sunset ending of Last Crusade. Almost like that was a perfect stopping point and we didn't need another 2 movies. Not sure if I have much else to say. Fine movie overall, but it's strongly lacking in the most important aspect of an Indy movie, the action. You can make a pretty good case for Crystal Skull or this movie being the worst, but now that they're out of the way, we can finally get to the real movies. Number 3. The Temple of Doom. A lot of people will tell you this movie isn't nearly as good as Raiders or Last Crusade, and while I am putting those movies above it, I want to make it clear that I still love this movie just as much as the others. In fact, as a kid, this was by far my favourite of the three. It definitely stands out as being more distinct in its plot and tone, with Last Crusade falling a bit short in this department by being another Nazis want a thing story. The vibe of Temple is so different from the other movies, and its tone is all over the place, swinging from wacky slapstick all the way over to child slavery and people being burnt alive. And as a kid, I loved how dark and fucked up the story gets. It felt like I was watching something that I shouldn't be allowed to see. Let's talk about the characters for a second, since they're what people point to the most when complaining about this movie. Temple of Doom ditches all the supporting characters from the first movie in favour of a bunch of completely new faces, which is a great thing if you ask me. I always liked the idea of indie movies being these very different unrelated adventures, with Jones himself being the only constant, kinda like the Bond series or the new Knives Out movies. In fact, the opening scene is a pretty blatant Bond homage, with him in the white tux, not to mention Sean Connery showing up in Last Crusade. Joining Indy this time is Short Round and Willie Scott, who most people seem to find annoying. Willie is annoying, that's kind of the whole thing, but I think Kate Capshaw manages to pull it off in a way that makes her more endearing than painful to watch. I love the fact that a guy who can pretty much do anything like Indy is paired with someone like Willie, and my favourite scene of the movie is the best example of that dynamic, that being the spike trap. Everything about this sequence is the perfect comedy of errors, and it of course ends with that iconic moment of grabbing the hat before the door closes, and it has the greatest line of dialogue in history.
We are going to die!
Anyways, as for Short Round, he's like the middle ground between Willie's bombastic incompetence and Indy's proficiency, since he can do a bunch of shit like drive cars and fight guys, but he's still a kid so he yells a lot. Him and Indy's relationship is unique across the series, and he feels more like his son than his actual one ever did. The scene where they're playing cards is great, and I love this part where he's wearing Indy's hat and copying his mannerisms. I think most people love Short Round, and of all the characters to drag out for nostalgia, I think they missed an opportunity by not having him in Dial of Destiny, especially considering Ke Huy Quan made such a huge comeback recently. I also like that we never find out his real name, he's just Short Round. The villain of this movie is Mola Ram, and he might be my favourite bad guy in the whole series. He's got literally nothing to him as a character, but I just love his look, his voice, and his personality. He's like the Emperor Palpatine of Indiana Jones.
Soon we will have all the 5 Shankara stones. And the Thuggies will be all powerful.
What a vivid imagination.
The only thing is I wish he got a more ridiculous death, but getting eaten by Crocs is pretty good. Now I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think overall this movie has the best action of the series. Raiders has the singular best action scene, which we'll get to later, but I think as a complete package, Temple of Doom offers the most. Not just the quality of the action itself, but the variety and creativity of the different sequences is just unmatched. Starting with a brawl at the club, then into a car chase, the raft, the spike room, the many fights in the Temple of Doom itself, the minecarts, the water escape, and finally ending things on the bridge. There's such a diverse range of different types of scenes and locales, and the action itself is all really good minus maybe the raft scene, which beyond being just a ridiculous situation, also has some pretty bad rear screen or green screen or whatever it is that doesn't really age very well when watching it on a 4K Blu-ray. My favourite set piece is definitely the bridge at the end, such a cool location, and the fact that they destroyed the bridge for real is just awesome. The minecart chase is also really great, and I didn't even know until recently that most of the shots are miniatures with what are basically just action figures sitting in the minecarts, and once you know that, it's kinda hard not to notice it. The only real problem I have with this movie that puts it below the other two is that it takes a while for the adventure to really get going. The opening in Shanghai is great, but after that there's a lot of hanging around of a village and then at Pankot before we discover the Thuggy Death Cult. Most of these scenes are still entertaining and pack in a lot of wacky hijinks, but it's definitely the weaker stretch of the film. I should probably also mention how Temple of Doom has garnered a bit of a reputation for having some problematic elements, mainly the apparent racism towards Indian culture. When people talk about this stuff, they're usually referring to the dinner scene, where they eat eyeballs and chilled monkey brains. I'm not going to deny that this scene is insensitive, but I think it's less racism and more of just a poorly executed scene, since the original intention was not to mock Indians, but to show that there's something not right with this Pankot Palace place. Indy had a line in the original script where he pointed out how weird this scene is, but they cut it for some reason, so watching it without context, it just comes across as, haha, aren't these people silly? I'm not trying to say that people are wrong for thinking the movie's racist, it probably is, it just doesn't impact my own enjoyment of the film. Plus, I grew up with this shit, so I'm naturally biased towards it. Last thing I want to touch on is the score, which is fantastic as expected, but I think this one is a cut above the other indie films with how many great leitmotifs there are, whether it be Short Round's theme, the Slave Children's Crusade, even Willie gets her own theme. The last scene that weaves all these together is just outstanding. All the indie soundtracks are classics, but Temple of Doom is my personal favourite. And now onto the top 2. Number 2. The Last Crusade. The last movie of the original trilogy brings things back to a more Raiders-style adventure after that weird death cult that nobody liked. And that's my biggest problem with The Last Crusade, it's just too similar to Raiders. If you ask me, the Indiana Jones series should be all completely different adventures with not much connective tissue between them. Sure, it's fine to bring back some characters and whatnot, but having the first and third movies of your trilogy be both about Indy fighting Nazis is a little lame in my opinion. Not just fighting Nazis, but fighting them in the desert while riding horses. Not to mention the continued recycling of Nazi villains throughout the franchise after this movie. But when it comes to complaints, the lack of originality is really the only thing I have, because this movie is damn good. It's got something that no other indie movie has. Sean Connery.
Junior?
Yes, sir.
It is you, Junior.
Easily the best sidekick Indy has ever had, it not only gives us plenty of comedic interactions between the two of them, but also allows for a bit of character drama for the first time in the series. Now, I'm not really watching Indiana Jones for some sort of emotional story, but I think the addition of some proper character stuff for this movie turned out pretty good, especially since Last Crusade is clearly supposed to be a wrap-up for this little trilogy, down to the characters riding off into the sunset at the end. Once Jones Sr. shows up about 47 minutes into the movie, it's nothing but comedy gold from then on. The best stuff in this movie is every time the two of them are on screen together, which is thankfully the majority of a runtime from that point forward. Most of it is comedy stuff, which is always good, but there's also a lot of good emotive stuff between them, with my favourites being the scene on the motorbike where Connery talks about the Grail, and this scene on the blimp where Indy complains about him being a lousy father.
I'm here now. What do you want to talk about?
I can't think of anything.
Then what are you complaining about?
For the love interest this time around, we get the most unique one across all the movies, Elsa Schneider. Marion and Willie were both definitely distinct but still had their similarities, but Elsa's a whole different beast, mainly due to the reveal partway through the film that she's a Nazi. Sort of. She's aligned herself with them, but doesn't seem to be fully on board with her practices. Either way, it's a really good subversion of what we've come to expect from the movies at this point, and allows the rest of the film to focus on Indy and his dad, which is fine by me. This movie also brings back a couple characters from Raiders, mainly Marcus Brody, who's actually along for the adventure this time,
Marcus? You didn't drag poor Marcus along, did you? He's not up to the challenge.
and Sala, who's just here to help out. Brody is mainly there to bumble around and be silly, which isn't really something he did in Raiders, but it works out pretty well here, and does lead to one of the greatest cuts in cinematic history.
Brody's got friends in every town and village from here to the Sudan. He speaks a dozen languages, knows every local custom. He'll blend in, disappear. You'll never see him again. With any luck, he's got the Grail already.
Does anyone here speak English?
Sala's also more comedy, but he's a lot more competent than Brody. There wasn't really any reason for him to be here, but he doesn't make the film worse in any way, so I'm fine with it. Our main villain this time is Walter Donovan, who I think is fine. He functions much the same way Belloc does in Raiders, a guy aligned with a Führer who's more interested in the artifact he's searching for than upholding the Nazi regime. But unlike Belloc, he doesn't really have many character quirks that make him stand out. Belloc had his silly accent, a weird affinity for Marion, and a rivalry with Indy that was really fun to watch. We don't even know Donovan is a bad guy until we're a third of the way through the movie, and after that initial not-so-shocking betrayal, he doesn't really do much exciting other than yap about how he wants to get those darn Joneses. He's not a bad character or anything, but he just doesn't really leave much of an impression beyond his awesome death scene. I still prefer the way Belloc goes out with his head just fucking exploding, but the visuals of his death are definitely impressive regardless. And he does still have some great lines throughout the movie.
By the personal command of the Führer, secrecy essential to success, eliminate the American conspirators. Germany has declared war on the Jones boys. Losfahren.
And while I'm not the biggest fan of the Nazis being the villains again, I will admit this part where Indy meets Hitler is so good. There's also one more new character I need to mention, which is Indiana Jones. Or to be more specific, young Indiana Jones. The prologue introduces us to River Phoenix playing Boy Scout Indy, and this whole sequence is magnificent. It's basically a super condensed Indiana Jones origin movie, showing how he discovered using a whip, how he got his chin scar as a result of said whip, his fear of snakes, and of course how he got his hat. It's definitely silly, but considering this is meant to be more of a lighthearted tone compared to what we've seen before, I'm fine with it. River does such a great job doing his own take on Harrison Ford, and the last part with Fedora Guy putting the hat on him is one of those all-time great Spielberg moments. He was just on fire with the editing in this one, wasn't he? Also want to shout out John Williams' Young Indie theme, which is so ingrained in my head. While we're on the subject, I'll also say that his score for the movie as a whole is just fantastic. Particularly the theme for the Holy Grail, which just feels so grand, especially when they give Sean Connery the Grail at the end. Now for the most important part of any indie adventure, the action. With this seemingly being the last indie movie, Spielberg pulled out all the stops of this one, giving us an awesome variety of set pieces. There's the young indie adventure at the start on a train, which when you look at this scene compared to a similar one in Dial of Destiny, it's easy to see how far we've fallen since the Spielberg days. This movie gives us the most vehicle set pieces of any indie movie, going from boats in Venice to motorbikes to planes, and there's even a car chase in there for about 1 minute. And to top it off, they bring in a tank for the battle in the desert. This is like a successor to the truck chase in Raiders, but it's cranked up a couple notches by having all the characters there, and Indy gets beat up more than he ever has before. I will say Indy being on the tank when it goes off a cliff is maybe a bit too ridiculous, but the part afterwards where he shows up without saying anything is pretty amusing, so I'll overlook it. Overall, the action is great as usual. I do slightly still prefer Temple of Doom on the whole, but this is probably a close second thanks to how frequent the action is. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about the storyline, which I feel is a pretty safe pick for best in the series. It has a lot more character stuff than previously thanks to Sean Connery, but it doesn't get bogged down in it. At the end of the day, it's still an indie adventure, a bit more lighthearted than before, and maybe too derivative for my liking, but still a damn good time. And I don't think anyone would disagree with me when I say this has the best ending of any indie movie. Starting with the 3 tasks in the temple, this whole sequence is one of my favorites across the whole series, testing Indy in a different way to what we've seen before. The way the scene is intercut between Indy and Sean Connery is incredibly engaging, and the final moment where he makes the leap of faith from the lion's head is so awesome, even if the effects have aged just a little bit. And when the temple is collapsing and Sean Connery gets a look at the knight standing there, man, that shit is powerful. And that last shot, that hits hard. How can you end on an image like this and then keep going for 2 more movies is beyond me. Also love the last minute reveal of Indy being named after the dog. A perfect way to end this trilogy, and Last Crusade will always be one of my favorite indie movies, but not my absolute favorite. Number 1. Raiders of the Lost Ark. You all saw this coming, and it really couldn't have gone to anything else. Raiders of the Lost Ark is simply a perfect movie. Last Crusade is great, but it wouldn't exist if it weren't for Raiders establishing exactly how an Indiana Jones adventure should play out. You've got a powerful and intriguing MacGuffin, some truly villainous bad guys, a love interest who plays off of Indy perfectly, and to tie it all together are some iconic action set pieces and a banging score by John Williams. The opening of this movie is easily the best of any indie movie. It's the scene people think of when they think Indiana Jones, and it's basically completely unrelated to the rest of the movie, which starts a trend that will continue throughout the trilogy. This isn't really relevant, but I always wanted the Lego set of this scene so badly as a kid, so you bet your ass when they made a new version of it last year, I jumped on that shit instantly. This entire opening from the title card all the way to the plane flying off is basically every single thing that's great about Indiana Jones distilled down to 12 minutes. After the coolest character introduction ever, we see Indy expertly maneuver his way through all the booby traps of a temple, but we're shown he isn't completely flawless and does make mistakes. Having Satipo there helps to contrast how in control Indy is compared to how all of us would probably act in the same situation. And ending with that run from the boulder, I mean, come on. It's crazy just how many of Indy's most iconic shots and moments are from this one sequence. And while we're on the subject, I just want to mention the cinematography throughout the whole film. This is the best looking Indiana Jones movie, if you ask me. I'm not going to pretend I'm some cinematography expert, but the way this film is lit, those Spielberg wonders, and the shot composition as a whole really just speaks to me. A really great video about the blocking of this movie is this one by CinemaSticks, which I definitely recommend. And it applies not just to this movie, but Spielberg's whole filmography, even the poopy ones. Also not really related, but Indy himself looks the best in this movie out of all of them. John Williams was brought on board to do the music for Raiders, which is of course an excellent decision. The original Star Wars will always be my favorite movie soundtrack, but the indie movies are a close second. The Raiders March, aka the main theme, is always stuck in my head, and it evokes that sense of adventure perfectly. The rest of the music throughout the movie is obviously great as well, with the map room scene being a standout. Time to go through the action, which isn't as consistently great as Last Crusade in my opinion, but it does have a consistent ramp up where each set piece is better than the last. We already know the opening is amazing, but after that there's the gunfight in the Raven Bar, which really stands out as unique across the series, since we never really gotten any other shootouts, and the lack of music throughout really helps to highlight how fantastic the sound design is. Next up is the basket chase through Cairo, which is a lot more silly but is a good change of pace. Then there's the real best action scene, Indy versus the sword guy. Then after a bit of fucking around in the Well of Souls, we have the best 15 minutes of the entire series. The fight in the flying wing, followed by the race for the stolen treasure. The fist fight with this big tough guy is so memorable. The best part of these indie movies is always seeing him get the shit kicked out of him until he eventually wins through sheer luck. And the flying wing itself makes for a really good setting, with it constantly spinning and everyone having to dodge around it. But the real good shit is when Indy gets on a horse to chase after the Ark. And this is not only my favorite action scene in these movies, it's my favorite action scene in any movie, period. In fact, part of the reason why I love Fury Road so much is that it feels like if you took this one scene and stretched it out to 2 hours. Chase scenes with vehicles are always a favorite of mine, and this one is just so insanely well put together, and it's constantly changing up the dynamic. You start with Indy riding the horse, then he gets in the truck, then he gets pushed out of the truck and has to go under it, then dragged behind it, then back onto the truck, then he finally beats up that last guy and wins the day. I love how gritty this scene is, it all feels so real, thanks to it actually being real. Shoutouts to the second unit team that filmed most of this because they really knocked it out of the park. I can't even imagine the logistics of planning and filming a scene like this. The score throughout is also impeccable as usual. This is the last big action set piece of the movie, so they definitely went out on a high note. Moving on to the characters, the OG love interest of the indie series is also pretty easily the best, that being Marion Ravenwood. She's got a lot of silliness to her like Willie, but not nearly as annoying, and more importantly she has fantastic chemistry with Harrison Ford. I personally prefer the idea of Indy not settling down with one chick, but if he had to, then I can't deny Marion is the girl for him. Although looking back, I guess his only other options were Willie Scott or a Nazi. Marion's also actually good at some things, unlike Willie, mainly drinking. Her best scene is easily this one with her and Belloc, when she's trying to outdrink him to escape. Speaking of Belloc, he's a great villain, and is the only one across the series who feels like a really good counter to Indy. Voller comes close in some ways, but Raiders gives us a lot more great scenes between the two of them to really flesh out their rivalry. The start of the movie establishes that they already have beef, and then there's this awesome scene with them in Cairo after Marion gets blowed up, where Renee talks about his rivalry with Indy and why he wants the Ark. Like he says, he and Indy really are equals in a lot of ways, as we see near the end when Indy threatens to blow up the Ark, but Belloc calls his bluff. And he ends up getting the best death scene of any Indy villain. Salah's also here as Indy's sidekick, mostly just there for comic relief, but every so often he'll just drop a banger line of dialogue out of nowhere.
The Ark. If it is there, Tanis, then it is something that man was not meant to disturb. Death has always surrounded it. It is not of this earth.
Alright, now for the problems I have with this movie.
I can't think of anything.
The action is all great, the non-action scenes are just as good, all the characters are entertaining to watch, and it just kicks so much ass. I guess my only problem is that the rest of the series after this movie was always trying too hard to be like Raiders, when if you ask me, they should have tried to do things differently. Temple of Doom did things differently, and that movie was awesome. And then Last Crusade, while still a fantastic movie, was almost a beat-by-beat redo of Raiders, now with added Sean Connery. Crystal Skull brought back Marion for that nostalgia, and then Dial of Destiny brought back the Nazis again. And at the end of the day, none of that impacts the fact that Raiders of the Lost Ark is a flawless adventure movie and will forever be one of my favorites of all time. So there's my ranking of all 5 Indiana Jones movies. I don't think there's anything too controversial here, other than maybe putting Dial of Destiny over Crystal Skull. Thankfully, the quality of the indie movies isn't as all over the place as something like Star Wars, but we'll get to that another time. Hopefully if you made it this far you found the video tolerable. I just wanted to ramble about some of my favourite movies for a bit, even if there's already plenty of similar videos on this site. This was my first go at doing written movie review type stuff, so let me know what sucked so future videos can hopefully be less shit. Anyways, I got at least one more video on the works before the end of the year, so stay tuned for that, but until then, thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe or else your head will explode.